This episode of Street Level contains discussions of childhood trauma, abuse, emotional manipulation, violence, organized crime, murder, corruption, psychological distress, and graphic themes surrounding power and control. Listener discretion is advised. There are some people who become monsters because they enjoy power. And then there are those people who become monsters because power once made them feel safe. That difference matters. Because Wilson Fisk was not born terrifying. He was not born the Kingpin. He was not born standing above New York City like a shadow large enough to consume entire lives beneath it. He began as a frightened child, trapped inside a home filled with fear, violence,
emotional damage,
powerful enough to permanently reshape the way he understood the world around him. And for people like Fisk, trauma does not disappear. It evolves. Over time, fear becomes obsession. Obsession becomes control. And control becomes the only thing standing between stability and emotional collapse. Every room must be managed. Every conversation must be calculated. Every threat must be eliminated before chaos has the opportunity to return. Because to Wilson Fisk, chaos is not inconvenience. Chaos is childhood. That's what makes Wilson Fisk one of the more terrifying people in Marvel's street-level world. Not simply his violence, not his influence, not even the empire he builds around himself. It is the fact that somewhere beneath the tailored suits, political manipulation, and criminal mythology is someone still trying to bury the terrified child who learned very early that love and violence could exist in the same room at the same time. And maybe that is why Fisk is so dangerous. Because unlike people who commit violence for pleasure, Wilson Fisk genuinely believes he is creating order. He convinces himself that every brutal decision serves a larger purpose. That corruption can become protection. That fear can become stability. That power can become love. But the problem with building your entire identity around control is eventually you stop knowing where the control ends and the monster begins. New York has always belonged to powerful people. Politicians, corporations, crime families, men standing high above the street deciding what the rest of the city is allowed to become. Most people survive beneath that system without ever truly seeing it. They see headlines, public statements, expensive buildings carrying powerful names across the skyline. They see carefully constructed images designed to make power feel respectable, safe even. But the power in New York has never really been clean. It survives through pressure, through fear, through influence spreading quietly behind closed doors, while ordinary people continue living their lives without realizing how much of their city is already controlled by someone else. And no one understands that reality better than Wilson Fisk. Because Fisk does not see himself as a criminal. He sees himself as a protector. And that is what makes him so terrifying beneath the surface. Wilson Fisk genuinely believes New York belongs to him emotionally long before it ever belongs to him politically or financially. Every building, every neighborhood, every criminal operation, every public institution eventually becomes part of a larger version he carries inside his head. A vision built around order, stability, and control. But underneath that vision sits trauma powerful enough to position everything it touches. Fisk's entire life becomes an attempt to escape the fear and helplessness he experienced as a child. Every empire he builds, every person he manipulates, every violent act he commits, all trace back to one desperate emotional need. Control the world before it can hurt you again. That is why Wilson Fisk works so well as the emotional opposite of heroes like Matt Murdock. Matt believes suffering can make people better. Fisk believes suffering reveals the brutal truth about the world. that power is the only thing protecting anyone from becoming prey. And over time, Fisk transforms that belief into identity. The suits, the penthouses, the political influence, the criminal empire, the violence hidden behind calm conversation, all of it becomes armor. Because somewhere beneath the mythology of the Kingpin is still a frightened child trying to desperately make sure he never feels powerless again. Before Wilson Fisk became the Kingpin of Crime, before the Empire, before the violence, before New York feared his name, there was a boy trapped inside a house filled with fear. Wilson Fisk's story begins long before organized crime, long before political corruption, long before penthouses and criminal empires, long before New York ever started whispering his name like a warning. It begins inside a home where fear controlled everything. That childhood matters because it explains almost every part of the man Fisk eventually becomes. People often describe Wilson Fisk as cold, calculating, and emotionally restrained. But beneath it all, of those traits is someone shaped by years of psychological pressure and violence during most of his formative years. His father ruled through intimidation, not simply anger, not occasionally cruelty, but constant emotion, domination powerful enough to reshape the atmosphere of his entire household. Every conversation carried tension. Every mistake carried consequences. The home itself stopped feeling safe long before Fisk was old enough to fully understand why. And for children raised inside environments like that, survival becomes psychologically long before it becomes physical. You learn to read in tone. You learn silence. You learn tension before violence arrives. You learn how to quickly love can transform into fear. That emotional conditioning becomes the foundational to Fisk's character because it permanently changes the way he understands relationships afterward. To Fisk, affection and violence are never fully separated concepts. Control becomes intertwined with safety. Protection becomes intertwined with dominance. The people he loves most deeply often become the people he feels the strongest need to control. And that is the trauma repeating itself through power. And eventually, that pressure inside Fisk's household reaches a breaking point. The murder of Fisk's father is one of the most psychologically important moments in his entire mythology, because it represents more than simple violence. It represents a transformation, a line crossed so early in life that Fisk never truly recovers emotionally afterward. For the first time, violence solves the problem. Fear disappears. The tension stops. The monster inside the house is gone. But trauma rarely ends cleanly, because once violence becomes emotionally associated with control and survival, it changes the way someone understands power forever. That moment creates the foundation of Wilson Fisk's entire worldview. The belief that strength prevents suffering, that dominance creates safety, that fear is more reliable than vulnerability. Over time, those ideas evolve into philosophy that eventually shapes the Kingpin himself. And maybe that is the tragedy underneath Fisk's story, because somewhere along the way, the frightened child trying to escape violence slowly became someone capable of inflicting it on an entire city. Fear shaped Wilson Fisk as a child, but fear alone was never enough, because eventually Fisk discovered something far more dangerous than violence. He discovered influence. And once someone like Wilson Fisk learns how power truly works, they stop needing to raise their voice very often at all. Wilson Fisk does not become powerful overnight. That is what makes him so frightening compared to other villains inside the Marvel street-level world. Fisk is patient, controlled, calculated. He understands that real power is not built through chaos alone. It is built slowly, quietly, through systems people stop questioning because they have existed in it for far too long. That understanding transforms Fisk into something larger than a traditional crime boss. Because Fisk learns very early that violence by itself is limited. A gun can eliminate a threat. Fear can silence people temporarily. But institutions create permanence. political influence, financial control, real estate, law enforcement, public perception. Fisk slowly learns that controlling the structure of a city matters far more than controlling individual criminals inside it. And over time, New York begins reshaping itself around him. That transformation is one of the most unsettling parts of Fisk's mythology because so much happens of it invisibly. While heroes focus on street violence, Fisk focuses on infrastructure. He buys loyalty long before he demands obedience. He turns corruption into business. He turns crime into economic influence. Entire neighborhoods begin operating beneath systems Fisk quietly controls without most people ever realizing how deep his influence spreads. And through all of it, Fisk maintains the illusion of legitimacy. That illusion matters emotionally because Wilson Fisk genuinely wants to see himself as civilized, refined, necessary. He surrounds himself with art, expensive architecture, elegant conversation, and carefully controlled public appearances because those help separate the man he believes himself to be from the violence underneath everything he has built. But the violence never disappears. It waits beneath the surface like pressure inside a sealed container. That emotional instability becomes one of Fisk's defining characteristics. No matter how controlled he appears publicly, there is always rage burning inside him. Childhood humiliation, fear, shame, emotional wounds buried beneath years of carefully constructed identity. Fisk spends enormous amounts of energy trying to maintain composure because deep down he understands how dangerous he truly is when that control slips. And eventually, it does slip. And that is what makes Fisk so psychologically compelling. The contrast. One moment he appears thoughtful, intelligent, almost compassionate. The next moment violence erupts out of him with horrifying intensity. It feels less like anger and more like emotional collapse, suddenly becoming physical. Because Wilson Fisk is simply not protecting an empire. He is protecting the identity he built to survive trauma, and anyone threatening it becomes something Fisk cannot emotionally tolerate. But power alone was never enough for Wilson Fisk. Beneath the politics, beneath the empire, beneath the mythology of Kingpin, was someone desperately trying to convince himself he could still be loved. For all of Wilson Fisk's brutality, for all the violence, manipulation, and corruption surrounding him, one of the most important things to understand about his character is that he genuinely wants love. Not admiration, not fear, not obedience, love. That emotional need sits at the center of Fisk's humanity and becomes one of the reasons he feels so psychologically tragic compared to many of the other villains. Because somewhere beneath the empire and the mythology of the Kingpin is someone who desperately believes he is still capable of being seen as human by another person. And that person becomes Vanessa. Vanessa represents something incredibly dangerous for Fisk, emotionally because she reaches parts of him that no one else can ever truly access. Around her, the carefully constructed image begins slipping. The cold political strategist disappears for brief moments, revealing someone vulnerable, uncertain, and even frightening by the depth of emotional attachment he feels towards her. But trauma complicates love, especially for someone like Wilson Fisk, because Fisk does not understand affection in healthy ways. His childhood permanently distorted the connection between love, fear, protection, and control. Somewhere deep inside his psychology exists the belief that loving someone means protecting them completely, even if that protection becomes possessive, manipulative, or violent. And over time, Fisk's relationship with Vanessa begins exposing the terrifying contradiction inside him. He wants tenderness, but he only knows power. That conflict creates some of the most emotionally fascinating moments in Fisk's story. Around Vanessa, he genuinely tries to become better, more restrained, more civilized, more human. She becomes one of the only people capable of calming the emotional chaos constantly building beneath his surface. But at the same time, Loving Vanessa makes Fisk more dangerous than ever, because now he has something to lose. And people shaped by trauma often become the most unstable when emotional attachment enters their lives. Love creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates fear. And fear has always been the emotional trigger that pushes Fisk to violence. That is why threats against Vanessa affect him deeply psychology. Because they do not simply endanger someone he cares about. They awaken the terrified child still buried underneath the Kingpin's identity. The child who learned very early that the world destroys the things you love if you are not strong enough to stop it. So Fisk responds the only way he truly understands. Control everything. Destroy threats immediately. Tighten his grip on the world around him until chaos cannot reach him again. But the harder Fisk tries to control his life, the more emotionally unstable he becomes underneath the surface. Because love cannot survive as ownership forever. And eventually, Wilson Fisk's greatest enemy was never Daredevil, never law enforcement, never rival criminals. It was simply the fact that control always breaks eventually. Wilson Fisk often describes himself as someone trying to save New York. That belief matters, because Fisk is never more dangerous than when he convinces himself his violence is justified. Unlike chaotic villains who openly embrace destruction, Fisk sees his actions as necessary. He looks at New York, sees it drowning in corruption, weakness, and instability. Crime spreads through neighborhoods. Politicians manipulate the public. Wealthy institutions exploit ordinary people while pretending to serve them. To Fisk, the city already belongs to the monsters. He simply believes he is the only monster honest enough to control it properly. That philosophy transforms Fisk from a criminal into something much larger psychologically. He stops viewing morality in traditional terms entirely. Violence becomes efficiency. Fear becomes stability. Corruption becomes structure. Every horrifying thing he does gets filtered through the belief that he is ultimately creating order from chaos. And that's what makes him so terrifying. Because Wilson Fisk does not wake up trying to become evil. He wakes up believing he is Thanos. Over time, New York itself almost becomes an extension of Fisk's emotional state. The city reflects everything happening inside him psychologically. Corruption spreading beneath polished surfaces. Violence hidden beneath expensive architecture. Fear controlling people long before they realized they are trapped inside it. Fisk and New York evolve together. And that is why his rivalry with Matt Murdock feels so important thematically. Daredevil represents faith in people despite suffering. Fisk represents control through suffering. Matt believes pain can create compassion. Fisk believes pain reveals weakness that must be dominated before it destroys you. They are not just fighting physically. They are fighting over what New York itself should become. And maybe this is why Fisk remains one of Marvel's greatest street-level villains. Because he reflects something terrifying. The idea that trauma, fear, power can slowly transform someone into a person capable of justifying almost anything as long as they convince themselves it serves a greater purpose. Wilson Fisk did not become the Kingpin because he wants chaos. He became the Kingpin because he spent his entire life trying to make sure chaos would never hurt him again. What happens when someone spends their entire life trying to control the world around them? Not because they crave power for its own sake, but because somewhere deep inside them still lives a frightened child convinced that losing control means everything they love will be destroyed. And that is the tragedy underneath Wilson Fisk. Because for all the violence, for all the corruption, for all the fear he spreads across New York, some part of Fisk genuinely believes he is protecting people, protecting the city, protecting Vanessa, protecting himself from ever feeling powerless again. But eventually, control becomes its own prison. Because the more someone tries to dominate every part of life around them, the more terrified they become of chaos returning. Every threat feels personal. Every failure feels catastrophic. Every emotional attachment becomes another vulnerability capable of destroying the fragile identity they spent years building around themselves. And maybe that is what makes Fisk so terrifying. Not the monster everyone sees publicly, but the wounded human being underneath it convincing himself that the monster is necessary. New York creates pressure. Pressure that hardens people. Pressure that breaks people. Pressure that teaches survival long before teaching it heals. Wilson Fisk survived that pressure by transforming himself into a larger than fear, a symbol, an empire, a force powerful enough to make an entire city bend around his existence. But the deeper Fisk sinks into control, the more obvious something becomes. Power never healed him. It only buried the fear deeper. Because beneath the mythology of the Kingpin is someone trying to outrun the violence that shaped him as a child. Someone who learned far too early that fear controls people more than reliability ever could. And over time, that belief transformed Wilson Fisk into exactly the kind of monster he spent his entire life trying to protect himself from. Maybe that is why Fisk remains one of the greatest villains in Marvel's street-level world. Because he does not feel impossible. He feels human in all the ways. This has been Street Level, the stories from the shadows of New York. If you liked this episode, check out my other shows. The links are waiting for you down in the episode description. I'd also really appreciate it if you checked some of the other creators in our little group, including Fandoms and Hey Anime, and let them know I sent you. Until next time, keep your eyes on the streets.